The latest flare-up over Syria between Israel and Iran has seen leadership on both sides talking tough about its red lines. But as the sound of explosions rung out across the war-torn country once again, what are Syrians saying after this fresh round of fire?
For sure, we don't care about them and their aggression, but we should not stay quiet, and we should respond so they don't repeat this aggression.
We are fed up with these insults happening every day. Yes, we are thwarting them, but this time we should have responded and teach them a lesson so they know we are powerful. They are not up for war. We were not scared last night, but I was happy to see how we responded. But we need deterrence. They attack us, we attack them back.
And senior Middle East correspondent Mohammad Al-Kassim joins me in studio with further details. Mohammad, we know that Iran is in Syria at the request of the government, or so it says. What benefit does Iran give to the Syrian government?
Well, it helped it survive this almost 8-year civil war, if you may call it. The Syrian government was on the verge of collapse if it wasn't for the Iranian help on the ground, as well as the Lebanese HEZBOLLAH militant group's help, but most importantly, the Russians. However, the Iranians did help the Syrian government with financing many of its operations, providing military support and military hardware to its government and army, as well as providing advisory role. But on the other hand, Iran has its own benefit and interests in mind. It wants to be very close to Israel. It wants to set up military bases in Syria to help itself. So it's willing to to help the Syrian government and spend money, as much as billions of dollars, to help the Syrian government survive for one thing and one thing only, to establish a military base, a military foothold in Syria, to be very close to Israel.
Now, we know that the IDF is claiming that this latest Iranian missile launch shows that the danger that Iran's presence there now poses to Syrian civilians. Does Syria really share that view? I mean, what's its stance when it looks at Iranian aggression towards Israel?
Well, we've just heard from the Syrian people and interviews from them. Even though no one in Syria really, especially in areas under the government control, that they can speak their minds freely, and they can even criticize the presence of Iranian forces or other foreign forces in Syria. However, for the Syrian government right now, it's very important to keep the Iranian forces in Syria. It helps to stabilize the government. It helps stabilize the Syrian army and keep it going forward. However, what Israel is trying to do now is say to the Syrian people directly that the presence of these Iranian forces on the ground, as well as HEZBOLLAH fighters on the ground, may have an impact, a negative impact on you. They may, you may be, targeted also because they are set up in bases near the capital and near civilian areas. So Israel, on one hand, wants to show that it really cares about the civilians, but really what it wants to do is to destabilize the government, to create some sort of a popular resentment toward the Iranians, that they may, force their government to expel the Iranian and HEZBOLLAH fighters from Syria.
Now, we did hear a response from Tehran's Air Force chief via the Young Journalists Club, which is, of course, a state-backed publication, who said that Iran was, quote, fully ready and impatient to confront the Zionist regime and eliminate it from the earth. Excuse me. Does Syria turn a blind eye to that kind of rhetoric, and also does Russia?
Well, yes and no. I mean, for this is a standard Iranian statement.
Right.
There is nothing new there. I mean, we've known all along since the advent of the Iranian revolution in 1979 that the U.S. is the big Satan, America is big Satan, Israel is big Satan. It needs to be defeated and erased off the face of earth. So this is just a continuation. It's part of the psychological power that the Iranian regime...
But as it further entrenches itself inside of Syria, does the Syrian government and at least the Russian government, I mean, do they turn a blind eye to this kind of rhetoric?
Well, let's separate what the Syrian government wants from the Iranians and the Russians. For the Russians, even though, Tracy, on one hand, the Russians want to showcase that they're trying to, be fair and support their allies, the Syrian government and Syrian military, but they're not really doing a whole lot. I mean, we see a continuation. In fact, we've seen an uptick in Israeli airstrikes, whether Israel admits to it or that those airstrikes that it admits to it, in in recent weeks, and this is something that we didn't really expect, especially on the heel of the U.S. Announcement that it wants to withdraw its forces from Syria. For the Syrian government, again, it wants to keep the Iranian there because it helps also keep the Russian government and Russian forces at check. Russia doesn't want to share Syria with Iran. Russia wants Syria to itself. That's why it has invested not only militarily but also money and other means to keep and stabilize President Bashar al-Assad and his government and his forces, and it doesn't want to share Syria with Iran. But it has really no choice. Iran is entrenched in Syria. It has invested so much as blood and money and military hardware and so forth, and it's not going to leave that easy. And that's why I think Russia, despite its public stance regarding those Israeli airstrikes on Syria, they kind of look the other way when it happens, especially against Hezbollah or allegedly Iranian bases and forces in Syria.
Now, we know that Russia supplied Syria famously with those S-300 air defense missile systems, but we know that the Syrians aren't, in fact, are using those at the moment. Do we know when they will?
I don't think that they will ever use them for as long as this war is ongoing. I think what happened when Russia made that decision to provide Syria publicly with these air defense systems, it was to show its dismay with the Israeli government for the downing of a Russian warplane. This was, we don't know, and we don't think that Syrian military is actually behind these air defense systems. They are not manning them. They are there only for the benefit of the Russian military, and also it's an answer to Israel when Israel downed that Russian airplane. I don't think that Syria really has control of the S-300.
All right, Mohammad Al-Kassim.